You are listening to the Vichaar Manthan podcast.
Namaste. This is the Vichaar Manthan podcast. I am your host, Sumit Sharma. Today is an interesting session we're doing. I'm speaking to Ravi G. Lakhani about an event that Vichaar Manthan is holding in London on Sunday, the 5th of February, 2023. It is at St. Giles Hotel, which is just near Tottenham Court Road Station. The topic is multiculturalism in the UK, the Hindu perspective. Ravi Lakhani, who we have had on the podcast and Vichaar Manthan many times before, is currently the national coordinator for Vichaar Manthan. He works in private equity and is studying his master's in finance at the London Business School. Ravi ji, namaste and welcome back to the podcast.
Namaste, Sumit ji. It's good to be back. Good to see your lovely face.
Definitely. And if you haven't heard from Ravi before, go back and look at the podcast. I think it was episode 2 where we spoke about dharmic wealth. But today, Ravi ji, we are here to speak about multiculturalism, and in particular, this Vichaar Manthan event that is taking place in London. So just tell us a little bit about that.
Well, it's exciting, Sumit ji. We're finally back in person after this hiatus that everybody took from seeing each other face to face and living in an online world. So the VM team is excited. We're excited to see our audience and our well-wishers again, and also to revert to what feels like home for Vichaar Manthan, which is this panel discussion in front of our audience where we can have a live Q&A and really deep dive into a topic that's at the core of some of the challenges that we're facing as a British society.
Absolutely, I agree, and definitely I'm excited about being back in person. You're right, it is those face-to-face conversations. It's where we can pass a mic around the audience and ask questions of the panel. It's where the chair can be really focused in his delivery, and that's what you'll be doing for us on Sunday. You'll be chairing the session. So just talk me through what goes through the mind of a chair when they're having to bring speakers onto a panel to ask them questions.
Well, yeah, so I'm lucky and privileged to be able to chair this discussion. We've got 2 fantastic panelists. We've got a gentleman by the name of Harry Markham, who's actually a research fellow at the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy. So he sits nicely in the sort of political theory sphere. He's also joined recently as a part of the advisory board for the Board of Academic Freedom. And this is a particularly interesting institution for Vichaar Manthan because one of the ideas that we're very keen on is this idea of liberty, and particularly in academia and the freedom to say what needs to be said, to pursue the truth, although it may be uncomfortable sometimes.
That's interesting to hear. You hear a lot about academics and scholars around the world now being cancelled almost, or losing licenses for simply having an opinion or sharing an expression, where, I don't know, other parts of society are affected or triggered or offended by words now, effectively.
Absolutely.
So are we governing speech? Are we getting into that part where freedom of speech is beginning to be eroded? And ultimately, I think, just like you said, liberty is being challenged. Our freedoms are at stake.
Yeah, and I think that's a key discussion that VM wants to carry on and to have with its audience, and also with policymakers, particularly for Sunday. I mean, we're talking about multiculturalism. So our other speaker will be a familiar face for the audience, Dr. Satyananda, who's written several papers on the ideas of Hindu identity, liberty, and democracy, and those crossroads of the idea of a liberal democracy. And this, for me, is really interesting as a chair, because there's a really key idea in multiculturalism, is that this idea of multiculturalism works and should work in the UK because we are a liberal democracy. And the sort of bells and whistles and benefits of living in a liberal democracy. I mean, I feel incredibly lucky to live in the UK and have the opportunities that I've had, and I'm sure you do too. So the idea is that we, as backgrounds of having many cultures, can come to a liberal democracy and contribute from our cultures, but also assimilate to the extent that we contribute to a liberal democracy. And that's really a fundamental idea. So as a chair, I'm kind of playing the role of the audience and being this curious person and say, okay, well, this makes sense to me, but there are things that we're seeing in the media and the news. The London bombings come to mind. There's a few attacks in Paris, and there's a few other policy questions that have come around immigration recently. And I'm saying, well, has multiculturalism failed? And certainly David Cameron in his speech in Munich suggested that state multiculturalism has failed. But
Wow.
to me, I have to play the role of an audience to say, well, I mean, it fundamentally sounds like a good idea. So where is the new information? What expertise can these expert witnesses or panelists bring to me so I can, explore this and be enlightened, as you like to say on the podcast?
It's a great challenge that you have. Then I've chaired Vichaar Manthans before, and trying to get that nuanced conversation going between the panel, and not that Vichaar Manthan's trying to provide conclusions of any sort, but I think you're asking some really poignant questions there. When you think about British diversity, and now we've got equity boards and various ESG targets that affect this very nature, we pride ourselves on multiculturalism, I believe, but you're asking a great question. Has it failed? Is it working? We've seen the recent episodes in places like Leicester and in Birmingham, where it's evident that social cohesion isn't quite happening right, and you've got various media arms in there, fanning their flames in the direction that suits them. But it's interesting, and wasn't it the recent census now that shows a decline? At least it's not the majority number of people in Britain that don't identify as Scottish, British, Northern Irish, etc., and what effect that has on society too.
Yeah, this is an interesting one, because there's a difference between people who identify as British and people who are, let's say, actually of British origin. And also then how many generations back do you go for British origin? And of course, the ultimate question is, what do you define as British origin? Are we talking about sort of proto-Celtic, pre-French, pre the Norman invasion and so on? So that's a key question. But it seems that, that the surveys and statistics I'm looking at, the majority of people do identify as British and do say that they are British, and that they appreciate being a part of Britain. The question here is not really, are people British? I think, and this is something I think our audience will resonate with, is that there's a fundamental part of me that likes to think that, look, this mixing of cultures is good. We get new ideas from everywhere. We can mix them and we can strain out which ones are good and beneficial, and it creates a better society. But there are some interesting ideas. So I'll just quote this one because it's quite key. So there's a paper written by a gentleman called Putnam, and if I'm saying that wrong, please correct me in the comments. But he stated that there seems to be a negative relation between ethnic diversity and social cohesion indicators. So we're talking things like mutual trust, solidarity, giving to charity, right? So if I'm Russian, I'm more likely to give to people who are Russian. And we see this in Russia, people giving to the homeless. But in England, where, London is one of the most ethnically diverse cities in the world, we're less likely to do that. And that for me was really interesting. And the caveat that I'll add is the latest sort of social research seems to be suggesting that it's more driven by residential segregation. So do we live in these, ethnic ghettos, ethnic pockets?
That's interesting.
And is that driving mistrust between communities? So, this tips into the idea of policy very quickly.
So have we been thinking multiculturalism is one thing, and really just on the surface, it probably looks like it is, but the more you deep dive, it really isn't. Tell me how policy comes into play with this. Why would the average person listening to this right now think, I'll come along to Sunday to listen to Vichaar Manthan talk about this? Where does policy come into play?
Sure. Well, I think I would come along because I want to answer these questions. There's a bit of me that says, well, we should all be able to live together, and that's a fantastic thing. But then there's this research saying, well, it doesn't quite work like that. And potentially, historically, societies that are very ethnically diverse don't seem to flourish. So what's going on, and can we make it work? In terms of policy, I think there's sort of two ideas, which is multiculturalism is how a society deals or approaches diversity, right? And specifically, we'll stay with ethnic diversity. And where it comes into policy is where we start thinking about the fair treatment of people from different ethnic backgrounds, different cultures. And there's a very famous report, I think it's by Lord Bickel Barrett. I might have got that name wrong, but he's suggesting that actually one of the strong critiques of multiculturalism is that people seem to see it as favoring minorities, that these policies are saying, well, like you said with ESG, there should be representation for somebody of a certain culture, of a certain ethnicity, perhaps of a certain religion. And he's saying, well, that's not quite true. And you can have a policy that actually does cater slightly towards these, let's call them minority cultures or minority ethnicities, and that's a positive way to level the playing field a little bit in a society where you may have a dominant ethnicity or dominant culture. So I think these are very subtle nuances to be explored. And the final bit I'll add is that one of the really interesting challenges has been, well, that's all well and good, but how does the local population feel about it?
It's true, right? I think things like this affect multiple layers of society, even just at face level, going down into policy. How does society as a construct operate? And just a final one, Raviji, if you could help us understand. So the title of the Vichaar Manthan this weekend is Multiculturalism in the UK, the Hindu Perspective. What is it we think we'll understand from our panelists around the Hindu perspective on multiculturalism? Is there something to be learned or gained or understood from that perspective?
Well, we certainly hope so. I won't try and pre-guess what the panelists are going to say. Let's say as a British Hindu, I feel like my Hindu identity compels me, or it makes me feel responsible to contributing to Britain and British society. And this feeds into, what I said earlier. So I'm going to speak from a personal narrative because, that's where I can really speak from. So from that paradigm, I feel like, multiculturalism should work. Those from a Hindu background have been shown to be immensely successful in the UK, and we're immensely successful in liberal democracies with good governance systems. So how can we make this work for the benefit of the whole of society? I think is really going to be the Hindu or the dharmic paradigm, which is, let's approach this with a fresh lens, with open ears, and see, can we make this work?
Interesting. Thanks for sharing. And one of the aims, I guess, of the Vichaar Manthan podcast is to see if we can understand modern day challenges and trivials through the eye of flourishing, through the eye of Dharma. Please do go online and follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Audible, and YouTube. So thank you, Ravi, for letting us know all about this event that's taking place on Sunday, the 5th of February, 2023. This is Multiculturalism in the UK, the Hindu Perspective. This is a live event taking place by Vichaar Manthan at the St. Giles Hotel in central London. The nearest tube station is Tottenham Court Road. You literally come out of the station, go straight, turn right, and you can't miss it. Sunday, 5th of February, doors open at 6 o'clock. I hope to see as many of you there as possible. I am your host, Sumit Sharma. This was the Vichaar Manthan podcast. Namaste.